It always begins with something small, so small you convince yourself it isn't worth worrying about. A scrape on the hand from rusted metal, the kind of wound every hive worker carries. A fleeting whisper in the corner of your thoughts that you dismiss as fatigue, or perhaps just a cough. Nothing unusual in the choking underhive air, where dust, smoke, and recycled chemicals cling to every breath. In Tertius, Magna illness is constant background noise, like the hum of machines or the drip of condensation through pipes older than empires. People don't stop working for pain. They endure. They bleed into their machines and return the next day weaker but still alive. That is why no one noticed when the cough didn't fade, when the scrape didn't heal, when the whisper grew louder. They thought it was just the city gnawing at them the way it always had. But this time, the city's decay was not content to remain silent. This time, it blossomed. A sweetness lingered in the air, clinging to the back of the throat, hinting at something patient watching. What begins as ordinary sickness is never just ordinary here. It is the first seed waiting to bloom into something far darker. At first, the changes looked like infection. Skin thickened around the wound, nails grew brittle, and the cough drew up mucus that shimmered oddly under the light. Nothing so strange, not yet, until you looked closer. Under a medic's lens, the sputum revealed itself not as diseased tissue, but as something structured, deliberate. Cells bent themselves into petals translucent, like glass pulsing with rhythm, as though each droplet carried a heartbeat of its own. It should have been grotesque, and in many ways it was. Yet the longer one stared, the harder it became to call it ugly. There was symmetry in the growth artistry, in the way the fibers spiraled together, as if some unseen hand had designed them for more than simple decay. The body followed. Lesions opened along the arms of patients, raw wounds that should have smelled of rot and infection. Instead, the scent was wrong, sweet cloying, almost floral. The sores bled, not pus, but a clear resin that caught the light, like amber hardening into ridges that shimmered faintly in the gloom. Those who touched it recoiled in fear, but the patients themselves smiled through their fevers. They whispered of dreams filled with gardens, where every cut became a blossom, every scar a branch twisting toward the sun. I remember one woman in particular, her flesh ravaged by factory toxins long before the cough ever reached her. Her skin split along old scars, but instead of bleeding, the cracks unfolded like petals. Tiny fungal fronds grew where stitches had once been, releasing a glow that filled her ward with green light. She should have been screaming, writhing in agony. Instead, she wept with relief. "It doesn't hurt anymore," she said, voice trembling. "For the first time in years, it feels right." The paradox was unbearable. Everything my training told me to call corruption presented itself as beauty. Rot had its own perfume, equal parts nauseating and seductive. Tissue once destined for death reorganized itself into designs that rivaled nature's elegance. Even the sounds were different. Lungs that once rattled with sickness now produced harmonics, wheezing notes that somehow formed the outline of a melody. A dying man exhaled, and the room seemed to hum in answer. Others began to notice. Fellow medics muttered that patients under my care behaved strangely less afraid of their conditions, almost welcoming them. An arthritic woman who once cursed her swollen joints began laughing, saying her hands felt alive. Her knuckles bulged grotesquely. Yes, but beneath the skin something moved, pulsating in rhythm, like the beating of a second heart. She claimed she could feel music in her bones. What unsettled me most was my own reaction. I should have recoiled, reported the anomalies to the administratum, begged for purging fire. Instead, I lingered. I found myself sketching the lesions, tracing their lines like an artist studying sacred geometry. Under the clinic's harsh lamps, infection gleamed like stained glass. Death was no longer a clinical reality. It was an aesthetic one that whispered seductively of hidden purpose, and it spread beyond flesh. Instruments left near patients began to change. Rust etched patterns in metal that mirrored the spirals of infected tissue. A broken stethoscope developed strange green patinas shaped like vines. Even the walls of the isolation ward wept, condensation that smelled faintly of sweetness, as if the very environment conspired in the transformation. None of this was violent. No convulsions, no monstrous mutations bursting forth. Only a slow unveiling, a gentle rearrangement of the familiar into the uncanny. The human form, once sacred in its Imperium-defined purity, was becoming something else, something that blurred the line between grotesque deformity and delicate creation. To most it was horror. To me it was difficult to say. For every pulse of revulsion, there came an answering pull of awe. It was as though the universe itself had decided that decay should no longer mean loss, but rebirth. That suffering was not an end, but an opening. And in that contradiction, in that tension between the terrible and the beautiful, lay the true danger. Because once you saw it, you could never unsee it. Once you breathed it in, you realized corruption had its own elegance. And against that elegance, reason began to falter. At first, I told myself it was delusion. Fatigue from long shifts, the claustrophobia of the underhive, the endless grind of sickness and death. Surely that was why my thoughts had begun to twist. But denial lasted only so long. Because night after night the dreams came, and in those dreams the whispers grew louder. The garden waited for me. I could feel its damp soil clinging to my feet, warm and rich with decomposition. Corpses fed the roots, and the roots in turn bore fruit swollen with pulsing hearts. Trees wept pus, yet their branches bent toward me with unmistakable tenderness. In that place, suffering wasn't meaningless, it was sacred. Every cut, every wound, every failure of the body became part of a cycle that stretched far beyond the life of one individual. And slowly I began to ask myself, what if we were wrong? For years I had practiced medicine as the Imperium dictated: identify disease, fight it, eradicate it. Pain was the enemy. Deformity, infection, mutation, threats to be suppressed, purged, burned away. But the patients who had changed under my care weren't screaming. They weren't afraid. For the first time in their wretched, work-shattered lives, they were at peace. They spoke of clarity, of harmony, of a kind of purpose they had never known. Could such serenity truly be heresy? I remembered Jeremiah Court, his body ruined by acid burns. By every standard of imperial doctrine, he should have begged for death. Instead, he sang. Growths sprouted from his wounds like coral gardens, glowing gently in the dark. He told me he hadn't felt pain in days, that the song of the hive had always been there. We had simply been too healthy to hear it. Was that corruption? Or was it liberation from a system that demanded endless suffering in the name of survival? Imperial dogma tells us the body is a machine ordained by the emperor to function in rigid, perfect form. Any deviation is weakness. Any mutation is damnation. But machines break. Machines wear down, rust, collapse under their own weight. And here in the shadows of the underhive, I began to see the body not as a machine, but as a garden. A garden changes, adapts, blooms in new shapes. It takes what is dead and makes it fertile again. Is that corruption or is that truth? The question gnawed at me. I wanted to cling to my training, to the certainty that purity meant survival. But I could not ignore what my senses told me. Patients who once wept in despair now smiled through their lesions. A man dying of cancer told me the tumors in his belly had become windows through which he could feel the pulse of the galaxy. A woman whose lungs rattled with poison described every breath as a hymn. Each cough releasing music instead of suffering. Were they insane, or had they glimpsed a reality beyond imperial chains? Perhaps the greater heresy wasn't to accept the change, but to deny it. To insist that suffering must always remain pointless. To cling to the idea that only unyielding flesh, untouched by evolution, was worthy of existence. The Imperium would call that faith. Yet in the darkness of Tertius Magna, it felt like stagnation. Death without transformation. Pain without meaning. I began to think of the Emperor not as the God protector preached from pulpits, but as the embodiment of a prison. A frozen corpse on a golden throne, worshipped for his stillness, his refusal to change. Millions die every day in his name, their agony fueling a machine that demands purity while rotting from within. And here, in the damp corridors of the Underhive, something else offered itself. A presence vast, patient, endlessly loving. Not cold, not distant, but intimate. It did not demand worship through suffering. It gave suffering meaning. I struggled against the thought, of course. Every fiber of loyalty screamed that I was entertaining treason. But treason to what? To a regime that burns the sick alive rather than listen to them sing. To a doctrine that would sooner erase me than admit there might be wisdom in decay. If that was loyalty, then perhaps heresy was simply another word for honesty. This was the true terror. Corruption did not feel like corruption. It felt like clarity. It felt like being seen for the first time. Each dream left me lighter, freer. My cough no longer brought fear. It was a reminder that I was part of something larger. Every drop of resin I spit into the sink shimmered with intricate beauty, evidence that I was being remade. The thought of cure began to feel insulting. Why would I fight against this? Why would anyone? And yet I knew what the Imperium would say, that I had been touched by chaos, that this so-called peace was nothing more than damnation in disguise, that behind the beauty lurked horror, behind the love a trap. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps the grandfather of decay merely wears a mask of kindness. But even if that were true, does it matter? If corruption brings peace, where loyalty only brought despair, which is truly the greater evil? That question is the knife's edge. It splits the soul of every man and woman who breathes these spores. Some recoil, clinging to purity, even as their flesh rots away. Others embrace it, finding joy where none should exist. I stand between them, torn, but leaning closer each day to the truth the Imperium fears most, that what we call corruption may be the purest form of evolution. And that thought is more dangerous than any plague, because once planted, it spreads. It lingers in the mind like a cough in the lungs. You may resist, you may call it blasphemy, but you cannot unhear the song once it has begun. They arrived at dawn, if such a thing could be said to exist in the Underhive. Redemptionists, their black uniforms gleaming under the harsh lumen strips, the silver aquila masks glinting like judgment itself. They moved in disciplined formation, rifles and flamers ready, as if they had come not for an inspection, but for an execution. And in truth, they had. The administratum had grown nervous. Reports of miraculous recoveries, whispers of new doctrines in patient wards, dreams of gardens that spread like rumor fire. They feared infection. They feared Mingtao. I watched them from the far end of the clinic, surrounded by the patients whose lives I had touched. Men and women who once trembled at the sound of coughs now hummed with quiet melodies. Joints, still swollen, lungs still scarred, yet their faces bore a serenity that mocked the Imperium's cruel promises of salvation. These were the heretics. The Redemptionists had come to purge the dying, the forgotten, the healed in ways doctrine could not comprehend. Their leader stepped forward, vox-distorted voice booming, "Reports indicate unorthodox practices. Patients embracing pain rather than resisting it. This is corruption, deviation, heresy." The words echoed against metal walls, but my patients only looked at me, eyes filled with expectation. They did not fear death anymore. They feared nothing. And in that moment, neither did I. I opened my mouth and let the song escape. It began as a low vibration, rising from the depths of my lungs, resonating in my chest. But it was no longer just my voice. The harmonics carried spores, microscopic seeds released with every note. They drifted into the stale clinic air, invisible yet undeniable. The Redemptionists staggered as the sound pressed against them, not a weapon, but an invitation. The patients responded first. Mrs. Korvik, whose arthritis had twisted her body for decades, sat upright with fluid grace. Her knuckles pulsed, swelling into nodules that sprouted tiny tendrils, each beating in rhythm with the song. What should have been deformity became percussion. The clicking of bone transformed into music. She raised her hands and laughed, not in madness, but in joy. Across the ward, Thomas Herrick's scarred lungs took the melody and reshaped it. His every breath became an instrument, wheezing once, then twice, until each inhalation produced a new timbre, a new resonance. The toxins that had once suffocated him now gave structure to his voice. He was no longer struggling to breathe. He was singing through every breath. And Sarah Chen, poor Sarah, her face marred by scales and lesions, smiled as her skin blossomed. Each patch of scar tissue unfurled into petals, opening and closing in response to the melody. She was a garden in human form, her laughter releasing a mist of golden pollen that shimmered in the clinic light. She was beautiful in ways the Imperium could never define. The Redemptionists panicked. Rifles were raised. Plasma hissed as it built to discharge. They shouted of damnation, of purity, of the Emperor's wrath. And then they fired. The clinic erupted in light. Plasma bolts tore through flesh and bone. For a moment I feared it was over, but death, I had learned, was never an ending here. Mrs. Dole. Korvac's body absorbed the shot that should have vaporized her. Her form ruptured outward, exploding into a cascade of organic matter. Tendrils lashed from her remains, sprouting flowers that pulsed with alien light. Her consciousness spread through the growth, nurturing, guiding. She had become a garden. Thomas Herrick died in fire, but his transformed lungs burst like fireworks, scattering spores into the air. Each particle carried a fragment of his essence, and as they landed, the spores began to hum his last breath. The ward itself sang with him a requiem and a birth cry combined. Sarah Chen dissolved into golden mist as the plasma washed over her. She did not scream, she smiled. The pollen of her flesh entered the air recycling system, spreading her joy through every corridor of the hive. She would never die, not truly. Her essence would brush against the lips of every soul who drew breath in Tertius Magna. The Redemptionists faltered. They had come to kill corruption, but they had only accelerated it. The spores clung to their armor, seeped into their masks. Their hands shook rifles, lowering despite themselves. Behind the Aquila masks, I saw confusion, fear mingled with curiosity. One ripped his mask away to breathe more freely, and his face was already changing. Lines softened his eyes, brightened with wonder. He whispered, "It feels peaceful." And he wept. Their commander screamed abomination, as if the word alone could hold back the tide. He fired wildly, plasma bolts scorching walls that began to grow verdant veins of living metal. The clinic's lumen strips dimmed, replaced by the phosphorescent glow of fungal blossoms. The very architecture bent to the transformation, no longer sterile steel, but fertile ground. I stepped forward, song still spilling from my mouth, harmonics thick with spores. "Not abomination," I said, my voice now carrying the voices of all who had changed. Evolution. The patients, the dead, the spores, the clinic walls themselves together, we had become a choir. The Redemptionists found themselves surrounded not by monsters, but by beauty their doctrine forbade them to see. And in that beauty lay terror. They broke. Some fled crashing through doors in panic. Others dropped their weapons and knelt trembling as spores blossomed across their armor like lichen claiming stone. A few still fired desperate, but their shots only birthed more gardens, more music, more transformation. Violence had lost its power here. Death had become creation. And in that moment I understood there was no turning back. The clinic had bloomed. The garden was awake. What began with one cough had become a symphony of fleshbone and steel, a testament to the truth the Imperium could never allow. But it was too late for them, too late for me, too late for this hive. The garden would not stop. It would never stop. The Redemptionists never returned in small numbers. When the first purge failed, when their masks cracked and their rifles faltered, the Administratum called for escalation. Quarantine zones sealed entire sectors of Tertius Magna. Flamers roared through hab blocks, reducing whole families to ash in the name of purity. Orbital strikes pounded the lower levels, collapsing corridors, burying thousands in molten slag. To the Imperium, there could be no compromise where chaos touched, only annihilation followed. But annihilation did not work. Every fire they unleashed spread spores. Every building they collapsed opened caverns where growths could take root. Every corpse they left behind became soil. Their violence was not cleansing, it was pollination. I watched it happen from the tunnels beneath the hive, where survivors gathered in places too old and forgotten to appear on official maps. Refugees staggered into our sanctuaries, coughing spores into the air with every breath. Some resisted screaming as lesions bloomed across their skin. Others collapsed weeping, only to rise moments later with eyes glowing faintly gold. Their fear dissolved into something resembling joy. The transformation was not forced. It was offered. A choice whispered in every heartbeat: fight and suffer, or yield and change. And more they yielded. The Imperium called it corruption. We called it revelation. The machine spirit of the hive, that ancient ghost of circuits and data, had chosen its side. Systems that once served only efficiency now bent to support the transformation. Air ducts pumped spores more effectively than any lungs could. Water treatment plants released nutrients tailored to our changing physiology. Even the power grid pulsed with strange harmonics, turning lumen strips into bioluminescent vines that bathed corridors in warm, organic light. Tertius Magna itself was no longer a city. It was a seed pod, and like all seeds, it was meant to spread. I remember the night I realized this truth. I stood in what had once been a cathedral to the Emperor, its murals flaking its altars long abandoned. Now its walls were alive veins of living metal, spiraling upward to form canopies of fungal bloom. The hymns of the faithful had been replaced by the harmonics of breathing, coughing, singing the music of transformation. I could feel them all inside me: Mrs. Korvack's laughter, Thomas Herrick's final breath, Sarah Chen's pollen drifting endlessly through the ducts. None had died. They had joined the choir. Dr. Matthias approached his form, already unrecognizable. His limbs flowed like liquid, separating into strands that rejoined at will. His voice came not from his mouth, but from the walls themselves. "It will not end here," he said. "The garden was never meant to stay in one place." He was right. Trade ships came and went daily, carrying with them spores too small to detect, too patient to rush. They settled in cargo holds, clung to uniforms, drifted into lungs. By the time vessels left orbit, the gift was already spreading to other worlds. Some would burn the infection quickly. Others would resist and collapse into madness. But on many worlds, the dream would take root. The galaxy would not remain as it was. And I wondered, was that damnation or salvation to the Imperium? We were monsters, abominations that defied the purity of the human form. But purity had never saved the hive. Purity had left billions choking in rust and poison, dying in silence, while their sacrifices fueled a corpse on a golden throne. If this was corruption, then corruption brought peace. If this was damnation, then damnation taught us to sing. The thought haunts me still. What if the Imperium is wrong? What if the true enemy is stagnation, the refusal to change the worship of a form too fragile for eternity? What if the only way forward for humanity is through transformation, even if it means losing everything? We once thought sacred, the galaxy is vast. Countless worlds groan under the weight of despair, each one a ripe field awaiting the first seed. The grandfather is patient. He does not force his gifts. He simply waits until suffering becomes unbearable, until pain itself cries out for meaning. Then the garden blooms. Already I feel them calling distant minds across systems, coughing in their sleep, dreaming of green fields, filled with blossoms born from corpses. The song is spreading, carried on solar winds, hidden in trade routes, drifting in the lungs of pilgrims. And once the song is heard, it cannot be forgotten. Perhaps the Imperium will burn us. Perhaps they will shatter worlds' glassing hives until nothing remains but ash. But they cannot burn an idea. They cannot erase a song. And so I return to where it began, a cough in the dark, ignored as nothing. But a cough is never nothing. It is the voice of change, the seed of metamorphosis, the first note of a melody that will echo until the stars themselves decay. The Imperium calls it corruption. I call it truth. Tell me then, when the garden reaches your world, when the cough lingers in your lungs, and the dreams begin, will you cling to purity? Or will you breathe deeply and finally understand that suffering is only the beginning of something far more beautiful?